It's my great pleasure to introduce our two speakers today. Kathleen Biggins returns to Point Woods. She made a presentation here about 5 years ago on the science of climate change. And Kathleen is the president and the co-founder of Sea Change Conversations, which promotes nonpartisan conversations about the science of climate change. And of course, I'm happy to welcome back also to Point Woods after 50 years, my cousin Carl Ferenbach. Carl is a leader in business and finance and philanthropy, environmental stewardship, and education. I don't want to embarrass him with his entire resume. And which you can all Google, but I will tell you one little thing that you won't find on Google, which is that when Carl was a boy, he was quite an excellent sailboat racer. And if you go down to the yacht club and you look at the old trophies, the Pop and Cup and whatnot, you will surely see his name, Carl Ferenbach III. As a little boy, I asked my father, so who's this other Ferenbach anyway? Because even for Ferenbach is confusing. He said, oh, that's your cousin Carly. He's a great sailor, which is the highest praise my father could bestow on any human being. And he's a really great guy. And I have always found that to be true. We welcome back to Pointy Woods. I'm going to turn it over to Kathleen. For those of you who are on Zoom, put your questions into the chat and we will get to them later. We're going to spend about half our time in conversation, and then we're going to turn it over to the room. Thank you again for coming and enjoy the presentation.
It is such an honor to be back with you 5 years later. I think we visited with some of you on Zoom in the interim on our climate and how it impacts our health and personal security. But I do want to make a little bit more of a shout out to two people here that are on our Sea Change team. Carrie Dyckman, who is on our executive board, who's been with us for 9 years, and Catherine Cinnamon, who have been with us for 6 or 7 years. And we have toured the country. We've been to 32 states. We've been crazy busy, and it's all been due to the incredible contributions of our team and these two women right here. So who's a... Had to do that little paid announcement. It is such a pleasure to see and meet you in person. I know we've had a few Zoom calls for this, but you sit in such an interesting place, kind of in the nexus between philanthropy that is really devoted towards the environment and towards the climate issue, and the markets and the economy, which obviously you have a long tenure in. So let's start off by talking a little bit about your philanthropic reasoning on why you chose to concentrate in this area, which historically really gets the smallest amount of the philanthropic pie. Why this topic?
Thank you, Kathleen. If I could just say thank you to Greg for that very kind, and introduce my partner of 52 years, who was here the last time I was here 50 years ago. So anyway, so how did we wander into to the environment? We had bought land in Vermont, a farm in Vermont, in 1987 or 1988, and as we were going back and forth, we were sort of weekenders, but as we were there, more land was becoming, that was adjacent to us, was becoming available. And Judy has a background in landscape design. And so we were messing with the land a lot, and we started to ask ourselves, and this was the age of the pollution coming out of the Ohio River Valley and creating acid rain. So we had a lot of acid in the soil, and we were experiencing acid rain in the late 80s and early 90s. The Clean Air Amendments, the Clean Air Act passed in 1990, but consequences of working through that, which happened much faster than anybody thought they would, but still took a number of years. So we were experiencing stuff that was going on, and we didn't really understand what was going on, and we were messing with the land, and we started asking ourselves, well, so what are we doing, and are we doing anything? Are we hurting the habitat? Do we even understand what habitat is here? Who do we connect with? How do we get answers to questions? And just as so many things in life happen coincidentally, the coincidence was a friend from business one day rang up and said, Fred Krupp, who is the CEO of the Environmental Defense Fund, is here in town. This is 1999 now, and could I just bring him by just to introduce? So Fred came by with John Hill Wilson, and we had a great conversation for an hour or so. And the next thing we knew, we had an invitation to go on the Colorado through the Grand Canyon that summer. And that was then EDF's sort of hook as for its development activities. There's a suspect, let's take them on the river. So we had never done that. And Judy's dad had done it with her sister years before. And so we both thought that would really be fun. So we went on the river in 1999 with Edie. And that was really where it began in terms of our, the hook was in, and we had to actually learn something about climate and the environment. And climate in 1999 it wasn't really on anybody's radar screen.
Right. It was still not before it was talked about in a big way. In some ways, it was before it was even taboo to talk about, which came a little bit later. So you were an early adopter in that case. So let's move for a second to a different part of life, which is business in the private sector. And let's go to that midterm, 2008. At that point, when it looked like there might be some movement on climate legislation, businesses really did not embrace that. They came out against it in part because they felt it would make them less competitive on the international stage. But if you fast forward to today, businesses, in fact, are doing the opposite. They're leading. They are pushing states and utilities to move more quickly than even the states and utilities want to do. And a recent McKinsey study showed that it was number 2 in the top 6 priorities of CEOs. What do you think has precipitated that change in heart, that change of view?
Well, so many things. Generational change was one, but in the 08-09 leading up to the final loss in Congress in 2010 in the Senate, the bill never got to the floor of the Senate, but there were a number of I don't know how we would characterize them as avid supporters, but there was a business group. Jeff Immelt of GE was the most visible, but there were a number of others. The utilities, who were particularly the coal-fired utilities, were all scratching their heads about where they were going with this. So there was a lot of interest in business in 08, even if they weren't advocates for the legislation. And the legislation was complicated, and that's ultimately was its demise. But so what has changed since? I think for one, the environmental community and EDF in particular discovered methane, and with that discovered that if you could focus the public, and you could focus the academic community on a single piece of the puzzle that everybody could understand, that had a huge impact. Methane as a greenhouse gas is 80 times more powerful, roughly 80 times more powerful than CO2, carbon dioxide is. And methane comes from 3 main sources. It's leaks and other emissions and flaring out of the exploration and development of oil and gas. It comes from farms, animal burps, basically. But animal burps are basically a third of methane. And it comes from everything else we do, driving our automobiles to heating and cooling our homes. And it's roughly in those proportions. So we understand those three things. We can address them. A lot of methane in the oil and gas industry is just getting a guy with a wrench in the field doing something about leaks, persuading the oil and gas companies that flaring is just sending revenue out into the air, capture that natural gas, recycle it, and use it for energy. And so a lot of effort has gone there. And there is now a lot of effort going into the community. But the ability to focus on something that everybody could understand became a part of the strategy of the advocates that became effective.
So let's drill down a little bit more on businesses' perspective today, because what we are hearing is that businesses also see climate change as a threat to their own bottom lines now versus just their profitability, just supply chain, market security, all that kind of things that are tied in. But also that there is real pressure on them from their stakeholders, from their employees, from their investors, even from their customers. Do you find that to be true? And do you feel that that is a big part of the motivation for them to get in front of this issue?
Yeah, so there are a couple of things, and I should have said this in the last answer, but start with Walmart. And going back to roughly 2008, the then CEO of Walmart just decided Walmart was then the grand pariah. Everybody who could, and particularly organized labor, who could come up with a rationale for vilifying Walmart was. And Walmart was trying very hard to change that narrative and change that dynamic. And Lee Scott, who was then the chief executive, came up with the idea that they should really take a leadership position, and it ought to be on climate. He rang up several of the NGOs, including my friend Fred Krupp, said, I'm going to go to the top of Mount Washington. It was in the fall. I want you to come with me. And I'm going to make an announcement on the commitment that Walmart is prepared to make to significant emissions reductions. And I believe it was by 2020, but I can't remember exactly. He did that, and that did have an impact. Walmart has followed through on that. So in many, many, many different ways. The major NGOs all have offices in Bentonville, deep relationships. So that was, one big factor. But Walmart at the time, this was before Amazon really took over, had an enormous influence on all forms of supply chains. And given that the supply chains had migrated to Asia and back again, Walmart had the ability to say, this is what we want. You have to go back through the supply chain for your products. And so that had an enormous impact. And my other compelling reason, I'm drawing a blank, but why don't we?
So did Walmart get in front of the bird or shoot behind the bird?
But Walmart definitely got in front of the bird and has remained there. And it's had an enormous impact. So other companies have of course, who don't sell Walmart or don't sell consumer products, had to make, so the other big change is generational. And so every CEO's biggest job, they would probably tell you today, is talent management. And developing the next generation of talent is a critical skill for all managers. And so what we've seen in the last, through the millennial generation, basically, but now in Generation Z, is generations that are willing to, when they come to their job interview, to say, like, Kathleen, you're CEO here, what are your values? They ask questions that, I would have cowered, even have thought about, our generation would have. And they stick with it, they mean it. So if you're going to hire the next generation of talent, you have to address the questions that they are finding interesting. And this is one of the things that's compelling to that generation. So you have to figure out how do you do it? The challenge for business leaders is how do you take something that isn't core to your actual business product, service, the things that you have been doing every day to be successful, and how do you integrate that into how you manage your organization?
So let's build on that a bit, because one of the things that we are hearing a lot from CEOs and from other types of business leaders is that while they have to keep their eye on the core business, there is a new recognition of both risks and opportunities that are coming from climate, because climate is changing so much around us, and because of the complicated ways that societies have chosen to try to corral it and react to it. So no doubt CEOs have a harder job today, but isn't it true that just the fundamentals of their business are also being impacted by the global climate risk? Or would you agree with that?
Well, it depends on the business, but yes. I mean, we've seen in the last couple of years, the major integrated oil companies, Exxon Mobil, for instance, who resisted all forms of climate intervention for just the reasons that you cited, Kathleen, has now got very well defined climate policies that it's engaging in. Went through a proxy fight a couple of years ago, ended up with 2 or 3, I can't remember, new directors as a result. And so we're seeing those that have been most directly involved because of their production of fossil fuels recognize that they have to have some policies in place, some process for addressing their emissions, and they have to be credible. They have to be able to be completely understood by the public, and ultimately they're going to have to end up in the price of the pump.
Well, the price of products in general.
Yes, right.
And I guess maybe I would add that there's also new opportunities coming. It's not just the risk and the downside. There's a lot of upside for these companies that can invest in new technologies. And
right.
I don't need to tell you about that because that's an area that you're quite versed in.
Yeah.
But there is the hope on that side as well. Let's drill down a little bit on the, hello? Calling question. So let's drill down a little bit on the changing economics, because I think we all know the old story, which was that making this move towards cleaner tech would indeed be much more expensive. And it was making it a hardship for us to embrace it. And it meant a lot of job loss without a lot of job. But today, that it's kind of been turned on its head. I mean, energy is significantly cheaper, about 40% cheaper than fossil fuels on a global basis on a levelized apples to apples. And we're seeing strides also in transportation and other areas. So can you talk a little bit about that economic equation and what you see going forward in the transition?
Well, we win, of course, if every day, if you can win in the marketplace. And I think that is having a big impact. But it's a gradual process. The utility differential between solar and wind is very evident in warmer climates in the southern half of the United States, for instance. You would think it would be less evident in the colder climates, although in our adopted state of Vermont, we see solar everywhere. Solar. And so it is doable. The rate at which we're adapting and adopting electric vehicles is probably surprising, at least everybody, at least for the moment. Whether that's sustainable is difficult to say. But it's still, in terms of the totality of what we do in the U.S. in our economy and what they do in Europe and what they're doing in China, it's still we are still emitting enormous amounts of greenhouse gases. China's commitment was to peak, I think, Xi is reaffirmed this, I think, and I think it's peaking in something like 2030 or 2035 and going net zero in 2060. But at the same time that he's saying that, they're turning on weekly, literally, new coal-fired energy. India has said, okay, we're going to leapfrog technologically. So we won't be as bad as the developed economies, and we won't be as bad as China. What they mean by leapfrog is instead of turning on a new coal-fired plant every week, they're going to, or every other day, they're going to do it with renewables. They have a southern location. They have lots of sun, and they can access wind. But they have to do it. They have to execute. So that's where we are. We are now in the age of execution, and will nations make that commitment? But this is my view personally, as opposed to all these great organizations we help support. But the corporations and corporate leaders are now going to have to actually deliver the outcomes very publicly so that everyone understands it can be done and that it will be done. And we aren't there yet.
That's a big challenge, isn't it? I mean, it's interesting to me, as you mentioned, that China is indeed coming out with that coal, but they are also bringing on board 4 times as much renewables. In fact, they have about half of all the renewable activity in the world.
They do.
Which concerns me because so often our conversations in the past have been, oh, we have to stay competitive because they get to use fossil fuel. Right? And we can't get off while they can use it. And now the issue is, oh my goodness, they are beating us in the race for all the new technologies and we are way behind. So it's kind of a cruel twist on that competitive theme from before. So what else can the private sector do? What can the people in this room as investors and as consumers do to help facilitate this transition?
Yeah. So there are 2 sides to the whole climate question, the 2 sides being mitigation and adaptation. So mitigation is basically where all of us are concerned is just finding ways to use less of the stuff that's causing the problem. Can we do that? Well, we can make our homes more efficient. We can, however, we transport ourselves, we can do it more efficiently than we do if we just focus on doing that. They're not big things. We don't have to all become vegans or pescatarians or something else, but we should be aware that farms and food are a major contributor to greenhouse gases. So what we buy and how we choose to buy it and from whom we buy it can make a difference. But so we can all affect mitigation just by relatively modest behavioral changes, which can have a significant outcome, significant benefit. The other part, though, is we're already experiencing a lot of the consequences of what is somewhere between 1 degree and 1.5 degrees Celsius of warming in the last since we started counting in the 1870s, but really most of that since in the last 50 years. And that curve is quite steep. Emissions are going to be greater. And the carbon dioxide emissions, once they're up there, they're up there. They're up there for a couple of centuries. They don't just go away. Methane's only up there for 20 years, 80 times more powerful, but it's up there for a short period of time. So in effect, or have an impact on what organizations are doing, but just making it clear that if they will address some of these questions in their own businesses, that will make us a more welcoming customer. And at the same time, thinking within our communities and the places where we live, what should we do to adapt? Are there things that we can do? Are there things we can do living in a barrier beach that will make it a safer place to live. Judy's family lives right on facing the Atlantic Ocean on rocks in Cohasset, Massachusetts. Sea levels have risen 18 inches in the last 50 years. They're likely, we're told they're likely to go up another 18 inches by 2035. That's going to mean a lot of flooded backyards. How do you prepare for that? How do you prepare the urban environment for that? And probably most importantly, how do we prepare and help the people in urban environments and low-lying environments? 35% of the global population lives on exposed lands, on ocean fronts. How do we get those lower income populations through this really existential that they're going to face?
So one thing that you perhaps could say puts a bow on all of those ailing parts from these changes are the economic losses. And we're beginning to see the insurance company price in what they see as a more realistic risk. There's talk about trying to put border tariffs. In fact, Europe is doing that to try to integrate the real costs of climate and these disruptions into the cost of the products and services that we buy and produce. Will that make a difference? I mean, it seems to me that the insurance change that we're reading about really was startling to a lot of people, yet the writing has been on the wall for quite a while. And it's just the beginning of what they're calling the great repricing. How do you see that unfolding, and do you see it waking people up a little bit more to the economic harms that are coming as well as the physical ones?
Yeah, we should really have somebody who understands what's going on in the insurance markets better than I do. But there's no question that particularly property insurance is market-based. It is a market-based protection that we all buy. And if we can't buy it, or if it's not affordable, then there's two big messages there. One is haven't got an insurable property, and the other is it's at greater risk than we thought it was. And I think we do want the insurance companies to communicate more effectively about their own risk analysis process, how they do evaluate, to just show up in a community and say, you've got too much exposure, we're not going to insure you anymore, without any prior preparation within that community for that, or without any opportunity for the communities to come up with a plan to address the risks that the insurance companies don't want to underwrite. That seems to me to be unprincipled. We don't want them to do that. But on the other hand, we do have to be prepared for the fact that that is going to be their reality. And so that's part of the adaptation process.
Yeah. I think this great repricing will be interesting to watch over the next 5 and 10 years, though, because there's so many areas where we haven't captured the real cost yet, and it's going to be forced upon us simply because the destruction is getting stronger.
Yeah.
So one of the things that you and I talked about in our Zoom is that this is not all gloom and doom. There is a lot of opportunity out there for us as human beings and also as investors. And I know you are very much looking at some of those investments that will be some of the answers to adaptation and mitigation as we go forward. The grid as we know it is going to be very different. The grid as we know it cannot continue, and it's already beginning to transform on our watch. But could you help us understand some of the new technologies that are coming and things that are exciting you about this transition, both in the grid and broader?
Sure. So what we
can you hear back there without the mic?
I
said mic.
I'll remember to pick it up. Like so many things, I guess we just stumbled into this, but the idea that could we have a significant impact? Could we even have more impact than we were having out of the foundation if we invested in the next generation of technology? So there's a whole, as it turns out, there's a whole venture world out there called clean tech, and there's a lot of interesting capital that's backed a number of new ideas, and they're not by any stretch of the imagination all in the Bay Area. They're all over the country. and some pretty creative and interesting stuff. So we tried to stick with something we thought we might know something about, and only work with people we knew. So one area that we have invested behind pretty actively has been the next generation of battery technology, or the whole area of storage. So utility scale storage is still sort of out there in the future. But it's there, it's being developed. But that may not be the great savior. But the current generation of batteries that we're using in EVs will be significantly improved by the next generation. It'll also be safer. One of the problems lithium ion has is that lithium is an unstable element. And so we've had a number of fires that have resulted from lithium ion batteries that were insufficiently protected in the production process. And the next generation will be more solid state, may also have different chemistries, and will be more stable. It'll also, basically, we should be thinking by the end of this decade that we can get double the mileage. If we can get 350 miles off a battery charge today, can we get 700 miles off the next generation? And actually have it be smaller, way less, take up less space in the vehicle, and cost less. So there's enormous potential productivity gains. China's led the parade on batteries. Right now, I think, to some extent at least, I think that both in the US and in Western Europe, there's a tremendous amount of effort going into new battery development. And a number of young companies that are now just getting into production. There's a wonderful Harvard Business School case on a company called Northvolt, which is in northern Sweden, started by by several people, but a former Tesla executive. They are in the process of rolling out their first big gigafactory. They're going to be Europe's supplier. They're up close to the Arctic Circle. They've got people that they've been recruiting from all over the world who're going to work in that factory. And just by chance, 30 miles from there, apparently, they've discovered a very large lithium deposit. And so suddenly they're going to be self-supplying. And so they'll be the low-cost player. They'll be adapting the newest technology. That's going on all over the place. And so that's exciting to see. The other places which are much more boring, but traditional production processes in the manufacturing sector around the world are adopting new processes or new ways of designing and producing whatever their product is far more efficiently than they have in the past. So just by being better at what they do, they are contributing to the reduction in greenhouse gases. And that's, we should be supported. We in the investment world should be supporting those. I won't go into the whole thing around ESG, but those companies are really the ESG companies.
Okay, well, I think that we can do better and we should support those that are doing better is a great place for us to wrap up our conversation and open it up to the audience. We're going to put out a mic. I would ask you to come up or pick up the mic so it's a little easier for us to hear your questions. And if we don't have any from the audience, we'll just keep on going. But I'm sure we have something out there. Yes.
Danielle from the back here. Sorry, I'm curious as to why we don't hear much about nuclear, since particularly they're smaller, safer, nuclear capability. Why aren't the utilities going in on into nuclear?
The primary impediment has been cost, and it's a great question. And there's been a lot written about new generations of nuclear technology, and that can we build? We have the capability to build smaller, more efficient plants. So it's highly regulated. the cost of, as a consequence of the necessity of it being highly regulated, has been an impediment for a long time. And so, can we drive the production costs down to a place where it's competitive, or will we scale up in renewables so rapidly that it obviates the need to go through all of that? And I'm sure what people say anyway. I'm not an expert at all on nuclear, but what people say is we'll see more of it. The other thing that's out there, and it's somewhere within the 2035. Well, I don't know. Judy and I took a tour with Fred Krupp and a bunch of other people of a fusion facility outside of Boston. A month or so ago, and I mean, they have built the base production unit that will build the batteries, which are gigantic, for this fusion facility. That facility is finished. They have the bones built, all the concrete built for the actual fusion plant. They expect to this started with a group from MIT, which had worked on fusion and pushed fusion for decades, literally. It's now in the hands of the engineers. They're very proud to say. And they're going to actually build a real fusion unit. So their ambition, at least, correct me if I get the dates wrong, but it's that they will, their prototype will produce, they expect, produce power by 2023, 2026, I think was their start date, that they would go from there. So that's do we test out? They go from there to actually turning it on in 2030. Turning it on means that a single fusion facility that emits nothing and has no spent fuel would have the power to power the entire city of Cambridge, Massachusetts, one facility. Their ambition, and this is a big ambition, their ambition is that by mid-century, I guess, that worldwide we have something like 10,000 of these plants, in which case we would be getting all of our electricity for a very low cost and with effectively no emissions. Is that possible? I have no idea, but we sat and listened to this, and they are making this presentation almost daily. Sort of what our takeaway was from that. So there's that kind of thing is there. There's their startup capital funded by both governments and private corporate entities and investors was $2 billion.
So I'll just build on that because you're not the only one impressed, because Microsoft actually issued a PPA to buy it in 2028, which blew my mind. I mean, to actually buy fusion energy where we aren't quite even sure how it's going to go.
Right.
And just to build a little bit on the nuclear, because it's a topic that we hear a lot when we go travel around the country, and it does hold so much promise. And they are experimenting with these kind of sexy looking ones that can fit right into a coal plant. They're so small they fit on a truck. And China is building 19 new nuclear plants, including one that they're saying they can get out in 2 years, which is something that we could maybe get a blueprint for in our country. So it kind of shows what other countries can do. The last thought on nuclear, though, is the role it would play in the grid, and whether it would just be a base load or whether it would pick up when the wind isn't blowing and the sun isn't shining, and it's not as good on that intermittency.
Yeah.
So so its role has to be well defined. We have to do it better. But it's definitely something that a lot of people, including the current administration, is very excited about. So yeah. Next.
Well, thanks for coming. My name's Peter Lauer. I've actually worked in the nuclear industry twice, both for Westinghouse and GE. So to go back with, I'm a huge fan of nuclear. Setting aside fusion, 3 Mile Island was said to be a disaster, but it wasn't. The the world tried to shut down nuclear. It basically did until a Southern company in Georgia
Right.
finally was able to build a nuclear plant, 2 plants. The cost of it was like 4x what it should have been if there weren't all this regulatory
Right.
nonsense. We made, in my mind, we made an incredibly bad decision years ago, driven by 3 Mile Island, to build a nuclear industry. The United States lost Westinghouse and GE's nuclear. They're gone.
Yeah.
We made a huge mistake. Fast forward. Just full disclosure, I'm an incredible denier of the whole climate change crisis thing.
Yeah.
But I feel like we're in the mode now of another, nuclear shutdown, massive decision, spend $50 trillion. That's nonsense. And so I'd be curious, like, what's your view in, there's several books written by some very smart people about, apocalypse never.
Yeah.
What's your view about the opposing view into this green energy crisis?
But broadly speaking, you mean
There are actually a lot of scientists out there that disagree with and I just curious, what's your view as to the opposite opinion that this isn't a crisis?
Is it that climate change is happening or that nuclear should be part of the mix?
Yeah, separate the nuclear. My nuclear example was just, we wasted so much money by killing the nuclear business. So are we at risk of wasting so much money again by doing something that will turn out to be a bad decision?
Yeah. Well, a couple of things, I guess. First of all, at least the actual numbers that we think we get out of the scientists is that 97% of scientists are solidly behind the issues associated with climate change. But I think there's a lot of variation, and there's a lot of different people are confronted with this in different ways, different aspects of the life they live, and I don't think it should be a surprise to anybody that lots of people are skeptical or are concerned, or I believe in climate change. I don't think it's going to affect me, so I don't need to do anything. There's a whole range of views that people have. So I think it does. And our thinking about this is all started with a continuum. Do we have a problem? I think we have a problem. How do we understand the problem? We turn to science. We get the best science we possibly can to understand what the problem is, and how we define the problem, and how we look at all the variations of the problem. And from there, we have to turn to policy. And policy has 2 elements to it. It's to understand what policy options might be there, and that can be primarily an academic effort, and is to a great extent. And then it's how do we actually select what policies we should pursue? What will the public support? What will be affordable? And then go to policy. And then from that point, it gets handed effectively to us as consumers, to the producers, to corporations. Markets and in the end will make the decision about policies, and that will drive what we actually do. And if you can keep the discussion in that framework, so it's supported by science, there is an understanding that there are a lot of different opinions, approaches, needs that need to be met in the course of doing something about this. And then you go to a place, rather than having government or some other entities say, we have to do this and designated winners, let the process decide the winners, and let markets make the decision. Hopefully that answers the question of people like you who are seriously concerned about making bad decisions and going in the wrong direction. And at the same time, gets us to the places that ultimately those of us who think that this is a problem and we need to do something about it tomorrow, actually get an answer. I hope that helps.
Yes,
I'm trying to think of exactly how I want to phrase my question. Oh, I'm Pat Kramer. I've been married in one of the 50 years ago. But I'm trying to learn as much as I can about the history and politics of the world. Anyway, my question is, and I'm thrilled you're here because my husband and I, who don't have as much money as a lot of the families here, but we are, I would say, comfortable, have come to the realization that most of our investments are with a company that does not have our values. Our values as scientists who don't think we should be fracking or mining diamonds in the Congo and that kind of thing. So we've been trying to reduce our investments that we've had that have done very well for our kids in college, things like that. Okay, so we are taking some money out of that. We're looking around and saying, what should we do with this money? And where do we go for advice, for good advice? We want some kind of mutual fund with, or an algorithm. We want somewhere to put several $100,000 and us put together with the rest of the boomers, we can put in a lot of investment and make big changes. So,
We don't want to take investment advice from me.
no, but how do we select what's it do?
Yeah. Well, so go to blackrock.com and literally, or Vanguard, and they have they offer funds and have for some time now that are focused on these areas. So Larry Fink of BlackRock has recently said he's not going to talk about ESG anymore, but there are a number of funds that are, it sounds to me anyway, like they are focused on you're concerned about the values you're concerned about.
Well, just there was a comment. As scientists, we look at some of the ESG stuff and it looks like a big scam.
Yeah, so well, and that's why it's under pressure. But there's also a lot of, there's a lot of legitimate stuff out there, and if you go to the right organizations, you'll find it. And you can.
We'll be asking you what, BlackRock and Vanguard. Give me a little.
Wait. So honestly, you're not alone. If you look at, so impact investing, especially for women and for the next generation, is booming. And it's incredibly important for those two constituencies. And Morgan Stanley has funds. Any investment advisor that you would be talking to anyway has these options. And they aren't always labeled ESG. And in fact, probably many of them less of them will be labeled ESG since it's gotten to be kind of a hot button thing. Right. But the idea of being climate forward in your investing has been recognized by the professionals, and they do offer a lot of choices. So I think it's really a question of making that first ask and you'll find your way. And if you need more than that, I have a good friend.
Great. So I'd like to say something nice about Carl and Fred and the leadership in PDF and what they've accomplished. And I'd also like to ask a question. Carl glossed over it, but your acid rain really was a problem that everyone remembers. No one talks about it. The reason is because fundamentally PDF benefit, cap and trade of SO2, sulfur dioxide, is something that utilities resisted for the plate. And lo and behold, they found rubbers and other things in a family way. So when you talk about finding a market-based solution at the prime example, we're energy investors by profession. Our relationships with EDF, I just want to compliment you. We are running our business largely with last year. So thank you very much for the market-based.
Thank you, Brian.
Brian Lawrence. My question for you is this: the cap and trade stuff versus SO2 in 1990. passed, but cap and trade for CO2 did not pass. We got very close to the Senate.
Right.
2010, I think it failed. There's some people who say that putting a price on CO2 would just raise costs and be painful.
Yeah.
There are other people who say putting a price on CO2 would push the decision out into the magic of the markets. We made lots of distributed decisions, which would be better than that.
Right.
Where do you come out on that? How advisable is the price on CO2 now? And how do we get there? How do we put it down?
Yeah, it's hard. Obviously, if it was as easy, it would have been done, right? As you know, and it's been subject of debate. Or I mean, they've had a.
That's a billionaire. With big carbon. Go ahead. Not really joking, but that.
So Europe, the EU's had a carbon market for some time. China has gone all in on carbon markets, and it's done it with a cap and trade system that they've been rolling out by district or by city. And by all accounts, anyway, they remain committed to it. This has been going on for 7 or 8 years or more, maybe. And so it's out there, and it's controversial here. So the risk is if we don't do it in an effective way, we lose the confidence of the public, we lose the confidence of investors, and it doesn't work. And it ends up with a bad name. So that's so how much regulation do you impose on putting a price on carbon? Do you put a price on carbon through taxes? Do you flow the taxes through corporate income statements? There's been Sheldon Whitehouse and several other members of the Senate had a proposal, I think that Sheldon put in a bill 4 or 5 years ago that would effectively have a price, have a carbon tax, and recycle the funds so that we would all pay it at the pump. We would get it back, or it would flow back, and so it would be tax neutral on the public. But it would add to the price of fossil fuels and therefore supposedly be a deterrent. Is that a workable process? I mean, there's a lot of stuff out there, but there's nothing around which we've had anything approaching consensus in this country. And so it's hard to see how we're going to get there. And so the EDF staff keeps advocating, but cautiously and without the expectation that there'll be an outcome.
So 2 follow-ups on that. One is, what do you think about Reggie and the fact that in the Northeast they've had at least on electricity a cap and trade that's been deemed fairly successful? No.
Yeah, it has. Yeah.
It has, and then on the West Coast there's some. So we have some little baby steps going. And then what about the tariffs in Europe is going to put on carbon so that countries that use carbon intensive manufacturing processes will be punished? Will that force our hand to do something similar?
Well, that's the question, and the whole border tax debate is a hot debate, but because it seems to remain in the debate phase. It doesn't get into the market, so we don't really know what the impact will be. Will organizations, governments who are on the negative side of the border tax find ways around it? What we've seen is that the industry is impacted by because they're engaged in fossil in some way, shape, or form, or very resilient. The oil and gas industry has just had 2 of the best years in its history, and in part because of the pandemic, in part because of Ukraine, and in part because we don't have the capacity to replace all the demand that we impose on, and therefore use fossil fuels to supply. So And I think one of the things that everybody who's concerned about this needs to keep in mind, if our starting point is here, 2023, how much total energy are we humans, just take the United States, going to consume in 2033, 2035? How much more energy are we going to consume? And so if we're trying to take fossil out, replace it with renewables, replace it with newer technologies, how quickly, how much of this increase from here to here are the renewables going to take? How much of the fossil that we consume today are they going to replace? How much realistically can happen? If you read JP Morgan's stuff on this, it's very cautious about pointing that out. That we consume, we're not going to change. We're unlikely to change how we live to a place where we just don't want to consume the stuff anymore. So that's going to be our challenge.
But the good news is if you flick on a light, you really don't care if it's a clean electron or a molecule. You really don't. All you care about is it's there when you need it, right? So thank you. So if we can make it seamless so that it isn't a sacrifice, then potentially some of its adoption can happen a lot easier.
We hope.
I'm being optimistic.
Carl, listen, great to have you back. And you taught me sailing 57 years ago, I think. Carl, when you were here 52 and plus years ago, if you were going to go from here to the ocean, it would probably have been about 66, 67, 68. It is probably 75, 76, 77 out there. We had 77 and above.
Really? Wow.
Yeah. You breathe the air, you're breathing smoke.
Right.
Right. It's really here. The crisis is here. I'm fishing for optimism here. The context is, back in the early days of the environmental movement, there was some partnership and collaboration politically. With the Clean Water Act, under Nixon, there were some things that happened. Today, we have a group of individuals who are going to plant 1 trillion trees to treat this crisis. So I'm fishing for optimism for you, because I think the elephant now no longer in the room is the political issues.
Well, there's we need to have public policy that is prepared to engage on and support of solutions, and that it depends on where you go in the world whether or not you find that. We don't find it here, but we find a lot here that people will embrace and that are supporting it. Either through philanthropy or the American way is to support through investment. You find much more consensus in Europe and in the UK, separated the two. We find the top-down judgments that are being made by the Chinese, but there's no question that they are investing hugely in clean energy. They're also investing hugely in trying to make it 1.3 billion people middle class, and so they are being cautious about jettisoning the fossil energy that's allowed them to get there. India still has a lot to go. So this is, a lot depends on where you are. A lot depends on the cultures. A lot depends on how cohesive your society is. And right now, ours is suffering from some division that keeps us from getting to any form of unanimity about what the solutions are.
So can I just jump in on that too? We travel the country and I get pretty depressed too. And then we've been into some very conservative markets that have a very different perspective on evaluating the risk of this issue. And to me, it comes back to economics, right? In a lot of it was that for them to embrace climate change, it meant to move away from the economic drivers that were providing them economic security. That is changing in part because in many of these conservative areas, job growth in the renewable area and in clean tech is way outpacing those that are being lost in fossil, in part because fossil has already been mechanized, thank you. To such an extent, they've already shed a lot of workers, but in part because these jobs are in different attendant areas. And I think that if you start with the fact that everybody wants a healthy planet and a healthy economy and a good place for their kids to grow up, it's just they have a different perspective on how to get there. And part of what was stopping them was the sense that they would have personal economic loss. And I think that's changing. And you look at just letting the markets run. Texas is a deregulated market in energy. 40% of their electricity comes from renewables. Why? Not because government said so, but because of the economics. And in fact, each household saved like about $500 and the economy saved $11 billion last year because of the renewable. Have we heard that story? Not so much, but it is happening. It's happening on a global basis. So I think we're at a point where that economic argument will change. And hopefully with that, some hearts and minds.
It wasn't very many years ago that the biggest investor in wind in the country was T. Boone Pickens, of oil and gas fame.
Yes.
I get all my information from NPR, and I heard the other day that if farming was its own country, it would be third behind the US and China in terms of emitting greenhouse gases. I think it's just fascinating, and I want to hear if you have any comment on it.
Well, that I don't know whether NPR's got its data right, but farming is definitely a major source of emissions, and in this country and around the world. And you know, as we said earlier, the animal husbandry, how you feed the animals, what you feed them, for instance, can have a big impact in terms of their methane emissions, just from animal burping. But also how we operate the farms. We're operating it with fossil fuel equipment, driven equipment. Can we switch farm equipment to electric? Will that be useful? Can that be accomplished? How do we store product? How do we get products to market? I'm not sure what, in saying what NPR said is, are you counting every step in the supply chain right up to the plate, and do you attribute all of that to farming? But in any case, it's definitely an economic area where there's a lot of potential for improvement. And I think, farmers tend to be conservative. They also live on the land. They know what's going on. They're experiencing whatever it is, whether they advocate something for something politically or not. And they're committed to making it better. So we'll find ways, I'm sure.
Carl, I'm sure we have some Princeton alums in the room, and I'm really interested in some of the things you've done at Princeton in terms of developing human capital. And I was wondering if you could tell us a little bit about that and what you've learned from that institute. Thank you.
Well, that's all. No credit to us; it's to them. But the university and the universities generally, whether they're the great Ivy League universities or whether they're all the wonderful land grant universities around the country, the science policy and general research that's going on at universities is phenomenal and has an enormous impact on as their student bodies are increasingly now in the workforce and doing more, making more of the important decisions that we have to make around where investment is going how it will happen. What Princeton is one example has done. It has had, as I think everybody else said, an institute, and what was originally called the Princeton Environmental Institute goes back now 28 years, I guess. It as opposed to being a core field of study like the humanities or like engineering. The theory behind the Institute is that it's a place where different disciplines can come to collaborate. And so while the core piece of what was then PEI was around the physical sciences, it incorporated the humanities into coursework, and therefore that faculty into coursework, and then the social sciences, which takes you to the policy questions, and economics. Although that particular faculty at Princeton is difficult because it's so full of Nobel Prize winners that they don't let anybody. They didn't want to hire any environmental economists, but that's I think a strategy that a lot of universities have pursued, and their contribution is in the science and policy research arenas, and it's in educating undergraduates and the next generation of faculty in those disciplines, and so that's been huge. As we've seen in more recent years, they've incorporated the whole agenda as the student body has become more committed to this set of questions and more engaged. The faculty has also become more engaged, and as a consequence, the whole curriculum has come to address it. University administrations have had to say, well, if our student body is here and if our faculty is here and this is what we're teaching, are we walking the talk? Because all of us who've been on university campuses know that they're pretty amazing facilities. But if you're not managing them to the same environmental standards that you're preaching in the classroom, then you may be sending the wrong message. So we've seen a lot of innovative stuff just happening on university campuses within the administrations.
Next question.
Carl, Spencer Hayes,
Hi, Spencer.
you also taught me Sam back in the day. You were sitting wire, so I have a three-part question. First is, do you still sail?
I married into a sailing family that I was just totally bottom rung on the ladder, and so not much anymore. We live on a.
My other question is, how would you rate the effectiveness of the Biden administration? And the subset is, what's John Kerry up to?
Well, I don't know what he's been amazing in terms of his reach and his commitment to the issues. John Kerry has, and so he's untiring in his pursuit, and so I think we have to give him credit for that. Whether his, as a former Secretary of State, is he putting his diplomatic hat on ahead of his environmental hat is hard to know. But in any case, it's going to take both. And he's working hard. And this past week, we've seen he's been in China. So on the Biden administration, to me, coming from my background and interests and commitment to markets as solutions to lots of problems, it's the Biden administration is very much good news, bad news. The good news is that they have taken on these issues. They've been very open to hearing a range of policy possibilities and incorporating those into the Biden agenda. And ultimately, they found their way into two major pieces of legislation the infrastructure bill, which arguably should pay for itself. And so from an economic perspective, we should celebrate it. But we won't know for some time. And the other is the infamous ARA, the Inflation Reduction Act, which is primarily a climate change act. And the concern so the good news is that they're coming up with policies to address the issue. The bad news, from my perspective, is that it's industrial policy, and the government is making decisions about who does what and what. So they're going to, for instance, take the subsidies for EVs. The more EVs and the more you drive them, the more subsidy. What's the consequence of that? Well, for the first time in our history, we have, during peacetime, war levels of debt that's significantly greater than our annual gross domestic product. And what does the IRA do? What do the subsidies do? They add, the more we take them up, we've created an incentive to add to the debt. So it's good news and bad news. We're driving cleaner vehicles. We're putting more debt on the government balance sheet. Will that come back to bite us? There's a lot of people who think it will. So that's the downside. Would we have gotten as far as we've gotten, and would we get to where we need to get to if we just did it with markets? It's a hypothetical.
Can I just ask a question to build on that, and we'll come right back to you. So one of the things that is also coming more and more obvious is that the cost of climate change is hitting our government's coffers. I think Munich Re just said we had $270 billion worth of natural disaster costs, and some of that's due to climate change, some of it's not, but quite a lot is coming from it. What we saw coming into this is that, again, going back to that markets question, we haven't really been capturing the costs, and we as taxpayers have already been paying for that.
Right.
So the idea of debt is a really critical one, but the idea that the status quo was not going to burden us financially is, I think, a falsehood. And I think it needs to be part of any conversation that the status quo isn't going to keep us safe, but it isn't going to keep our economy safe either. So something has to give. And I'm not saying that Biden's the way to do it, but the other thing is that as we talk about a carbon tax, one of the things that the countries are trying to do is just stop subsidizing the use of fossil fuels.
Right.
And we haven't been able to do that. And that's kind of amazing. You can't even stop incentivizing the use of the thing that's causing them.
Everybody know what Kathleen is. We subsidized our oil and gas industry. We subsidized oil and gas production. At the same time, we're trying to reduce it. No, we subsidize it at the same time we're trying to reduce it. As a matter of policy, it's been in place for I don't know how long, but all of the 20th century. And this one. So.
And I interrupted you. So
It's back to the question of hope. So I run a life science fund that's focused on finding cures for diseases. They focus on human health.
Yeah.
There's obviously a strong connection between human health and planetary health. And so we've launched a fund focused on creating companies. So every day I look at innovation, new emerging technology. Just curious, what technologies that you see your top 2 or 3 or initiatives that you think are going to make a difference in the next 5 to 10 years?
Oh gosh. Well, so I wish I knew more about the biosciences, because I mean, look at what biosciences did with COVID, which is pretty phenomenal. So
That was one of our companies.
was it? Yeah. So it's. I mean, that came from nowhere. So I hate to predict what might make a difference. And I'm much more from the school of can we just do everything a little better every day? The constant improvement, constant analysis of what we're doing and how we do it better is what ultimately gets us to where we need to get to. And so I don't even know how to think about the next great purchase. I mean, where we have put capital has been in the next generation of batteries and and every place else we put capital, it's just been, one at a time, somebody doing something better, smarter, that ultimately produces a better outcome.
So I want to just add something to the battery suggestions, because I think people think, oh, batteries got it in a car or maybe on my power wall, but I don't know that they realize what it can do for the grid and the flexibility it gives, how it can turn all of us into power smoother. So can you talk about what these innovations in batteries translates to more on that?
I'm not sure I can but I comment on the grid because that's worth, the grid is going to be a real challenge for us. The grid that we have now is not built and doesn't have the capacity to be an effective transmission agent for particularly renewables. But it also has real capacity limitations. And our demand is growing significantly, just the actual demand each of us creates in terms of what we use. And then on top of that, the fact that we're using all these new devices that we want to be powered by electricity. So the demand curve is steep, and we did not get into the IRA and not a lot into the infrastructure legislation, grid expansion and grid upgrades. And that's going to be a challenge for us, for everybody, for everything. So we're going to have to invest in the grid. And if we're going to go down this road, and if we're actually going to have the capability to ultimately put all the funding to work in some way, we're going to have to do something with the grid.
Well, I just wanted to take us back a little bit to the subsidies for public gas. I've spent a bunch of time learning about the carbon fee and dividend concept, et cetera. And I'm just curious if you could expand a little bit on the oil and gas subsidies, how much they are, and what you think would happen if just and they disappear tomorrow, how much money, where that money can go, and just what you think the impact is.
Yeah, Tori, I don't know, but and I don't know if anybody in the room has a background in oil and gas. Yeah, he does. Yes, Brian does.
Go ahead. Grab the mic.
Oil and gas subsidies is sort of a hot topic. People like to talk about it. I would sort of divide it into two categories. There are countries out there like Saudi Arabia or Venezuela, where a big part of being a citizen of those countries is the ability to buy gasoline for 25 cents a gallon or something. So when you see gasoline and oil and gas subsidies in hundreds of billions of dollars, it's that. US, and I've looked at this over and over and over again, it might be 10 billion a year, which sounds like a lot, but we're spending 6 trillion.
Yeah.
So it's really small. And this IRA Act is hundreds of billions of dollars in renewable stuff in it. So I think if you ended the oil and gas subsidies, it would have a very small impact. Also, I think what you have to do is you have to say, well, oil and gas is subsidized, but every time you buy a gallon of gasoline, you pay tax on it. And the taxes are not as high here as they are in Europe. But I think if you took the subsidies, but you netted against them the taxes paid, I think oil and gas is a big tax contributor, unfortunately. So it's nice to talk about. I don't think it changes the answer.
Right.
So just one question on the global, because I know the G7 has come out and said this is one of their primary strategies on climate change. It's to stop the subsidization of oil and gas. And I think it's probably more outside of our country. But do you think it's a bigger issue there? Because my sense of this is that it's a critical strategy that they have put forward.
It is, but I think the numbers in this country, last time I did the math, it's something like oil and gas is paying in this country through these highway taxes, or whatever, something on the order of 50 or 60 billion, but it's being subsidized 10 billion. Whereas Saudi Arabia is probably getting away, I don't even know how many tens of billions of dollars of very subsidized fuel. So I think what you're talking about is, if you get the Saudis to stop doing it.
Yeah, right on it.
And the Iraqis.
Right on it. Did you want to add something?
No,
Yeah,
that's
sure.
great.
Okay, more questions? And then we're almost to the end of our time, so.
Thank you, my name is Duke Kramer. Sorry. I'm not sure, I'm always not so great at admin questions, so I only have to roughly thought this out. I've heard a lot of, I really enjoyed the presentation and multidimensional part is always great. We've talked a lot of time, a number of times it has come up that this is going to have impact on the way the economics is done and the marketplace is going to do this thing, but there's going to be some changes. I'm an scientist out of his depth. I've tried really hard to learn enough about economics to see how environmental policies interact with science. The science and environmental policies interact within the realm of the marketplace. I'm certainly naive about that, but I have come across a number of basic assumptions that seem absolutely baked into economics, which seem to me totally flawed and unreasonable and unjustified. The scientists talking. And so the question is, can we really make the changes that the economic marketplace needs to make? We don't address some of these, actually more flawed assumptions which economists just literally make. And the two of them, that's the general idea of the question. And the two that bother me that I've struggled to understand how to possibly justify them are the discount rate, which says that money is worth more now than in the future. So if you're trying to do something on the benefit of people in the next generations, that's just not as important as what we do with our money now. That's a really my simple explanation. But discounting has to do with the relative changes over time. And the second one is externalities. We don't charge the people that are causing the problem for all the damages they cause. And externalities just are a good way to get rid of all the things that you don't want to have to be responsible for. And yet we let them get away with it. So it seems to me those two alone, and I'm sure there are more. Models don't work. Can we possibly make the changes in the marketplace that needs to be made without dealing with these fundamentally irrational ideas that are just built into economics like externalities?
Yeah. Well, first externalities. I wish that we had a good answer to externalities, but I think what happens in so many policy areas is that in order to, and this has happened, and the Biden administration has done it in different areas, and others have too. We want to kickstart something, so we subsidize it. So we want to catch up with China on batteries. We want to catch up on EVs. We want to catch up on, you pick the technology. So in the industrial policy world that we're working in now, government says, great, we'll get behind that. And you find subsidies. Once you've done it, it's really hard. We've seen over and over. You see it in every walk of life. It's really hard to undo it. So the externality of today was the incentive of yesterday, many times. And so number one. Number two, don't think discount rate so much. Capital, like everything else, has a cost. Capital is priced on risk, and risk is analyzable based upon what you think the future return to capital is. In some cases, it's the future return is a contract. That's a debt instrument. But in other cases, it's your ownership share, your share of stock, or whatever, your partnership interest. And you have to analyze the business to understand what the future cash flow from that particular investment is, and what discount rate would you apply to taking that risk. And so that's so I've always preached, if you will, that most people and many business leaders don't understand that simple piece of reality, which is that capital has a cost. That the cost, in the cost is an understanding of risk, and the risk is based on an analysis of what that in this case business is capable of doing.